Hello, and welcome to AMA Puget Sound's live Coffee Talk series. And before we begin, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Our chapter, AMA Puget Sound, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we serve marketing professionals in the Seattle-Tacoma metro area since 1944. I also want to thank Fujisan Marketing, our annual sponsor, for their continued support. We are very excited today. Our guest today is Chris Hurd. He's the founder and CEO of First Base HQ. First Base, it's an all-in-one provisioning platform for remote teams. Their platform lets companies set up, supply, maintain, manage, and retrieve all the physical equipment remote workers need to get their great work at home done as a monthly subscription. I kind of muddled all of that, but we're going to talk about your company a little more, Chris. So thank you so much. Like I said before we started, thank you so much. I know you're very busy. I appreciate the time that you're spending with us. And can you tell us a little bit about First Base? You were kind of telling me before we started how First Base started. You said it was starting in financial, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's the old startup story of you start out doing one thing and very quickly you realize that the value that other people need is in a different area. So yeah, we started out building a financial technology company, decided we were going to be remote for a number of reasons, but I think most importantly, I want to spend more time with my family. So missed my daughter walk for the first time, never heard her laugh for the first time. And as I founded a business, I thought, okay, now I can control like how frequently I'm in an office. I'm never going to be in an office. And yeah, we just, during that process, realized how hard it was to get a remote team set up. And eventually I realized, hey, this is a problem everyone else is struggling with as well. Maybe we should pivot the business to focus on that.
Mm-hmm. And so what time period, not time period, but what year was that roughly?
So we founded that business in March 2018.
Okay.
So we've been remote. I've been remote probably a time prior to that. We never pivoted to focus on the remote product until September 2019.
Okay. So then the pandemic hit and you're like, this is perfect. This is great. Yeah, our time has come.
Pandemic hits and you're like, damn, I wish we pivoted 6 months earlier.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. But hey, we're pivoting now. So that's fantastic. Yeah. Before we get into it, this is a coffee talk series, and I'm just curious, what do you have in your cup today? I've got some coffee.
Yeah, I mean it's just a little bit later in the day for me, so I've already had probably 2 or 3 double espressos. So
gotcha.
Today I am on the sparkling lime water, I think.
Ooh, excellent. So yeah, you alluded, we're in a bit of a time difference. It's 11 o'clock a.m. for me here in the Seattle area. And what time is it for you right now?
It has just turned 7 o'clock at night in Scotland.
So again, thank you so much for spending your evening with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's get right into it. The reason why I really wanted to talk to you is because of the survey that you've been asking folks for the last 10 months. What is remote? What is that going to look like? And before we kick off, I just wanted to kind of highlight a blog post that's on the First Base's website. Companies who remain office first will be replaced by companies who go remote first. And I just wanted to kind of touch on that for a second before we really dive in as to why that is.
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. So I think the way we see it, and this is more of a historical look, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, right? Everyone, I think, go back 10 years ago, and everyone was like, well, e-commerce is cool, but are we ever going to buy stuff online? Bricks and mortar retail is always going to be here. We're going to go to stores. And I think everyone in hindsight knows how quickly that changed. Like Amazon comes and eats everyone's lunch. I think like we see the same thing where rather than it being now you can access the inventory of everything that anyone's ever had the same way that Amazon did, well, now it's going to be not only can you just hire the best person in a 30-mile radius, you can hire the best person in the whole planet. And at the same time, that does a number of things. I think we're going to get onto later, so I'm not going to go into too much on the diversity and inclusive side. But yeah, I think in many respects, it's about there's like this remote work dilemma, right? Where if your competitor is more remote than you, then they are more talented because their pool's bigger, and they're also more cost efficient because they're not spending $15,000 a year per worker on office space.
Right. Exactly. And so what do you say to companies or to leaders who disagree with you, who say, oh, no. As soon as the pandemic's over, everybody's going to come back to the office because they want to come to the office. What do you say to those folks?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation. So we done a poll on LinkedIn last week. 38,000 respondents.
I was one of them.
4% of people want to go back to an office full time, and I think it's there's a huge amount of dissonance there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone thinks that every one of that 4% thinks that they're in the 96%. Well, everyone else wants to go back to the office, so that's where the team's going to be. The reality is, like, the majority of people don't want to be in the office a majority of the time. Like, that makes sense. 30% of people never want to go back to an office full time. And I think when you start to think of it in that terms, well, if you force people back to an office, you're going to lose a lot of talented people who don't want to be there. Right. Sure, there are going to be people who do want to be there, but at large and on average, your people don't want to be there.
Right. And then I can also hear, company leaders saying, well, but we have a foosball table. We have free beer on Fridays. Why wouldn't you want to come into the office for that? And you can network with your peers.
Yeah, and I think my response is, like, you speak to Google engineers and only 8% of them want to go back full time. Like, Google's the best office experience on the planet. Like, they're going to feed you, they're going to do your laundry, they're going to give you massages, you've got games consoles, and only 8% of them want to go back. So I would be like, do you guys do what they do? Because actually less people probably want to go back to your office than they do.
Exactly. And exactly. I'm with you. I'm more remote. And the job that I have right now is fully remote, which is fantastic. And so my husband and I were talking the other day of, once this is all over, do you want to go back into the office? And I'm like, no, not really. Maybe once a week I can see that. Just because the things that I do miss are, I miss seeing people, I miss, you can have video calls like this, but for some reason that in person, there's just something to it, having those little water cooler chats and things. But I think at the same time, we were almost forced to do that because we were stuck in this office together. So, is it really valuable? Is it really meaningful? So this whole conversation is extremely fascinating. So yeah,
I sort of just wonder how that changes, because I think you're right. Like, I think there's still something to meeting physically to build a relationship. So for the first time, being able to have that relationship. After that, it's like, okay, is having a call like this after we've been together physically, is it 20% worse? Probably not. Is it like it's probably somewhere between like 10 and 5% worse, maybe. But if you continue to renew that relationship, so you are going to continue to meet up physically, maybe it's once a month, maybe it's once a quarter, maybe it's once every 2 weeks, whatever it is. I think still knowing that you are going to get together physically enables you to maintain that relationship better than the alternative, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And while you're talking, I'm immediately thinking, I don't know if this this was a very popular meme yesterday here in the US. Through the inauguration, there's a picture of Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders, sitting by himself, like all bundled up. And the meme was, this could have been an email. And so I'm just thinking of that, like how many times a meeting could have literally just been an email or a Slack message.
Yeah, emails, Slack messages. And I think that's something people have realized. Like, there's a lot of things that were, and take a step further, that were synchronous communication, where you were in an office where do you really need to go and tap someone on the shoulder and knock them out of flow for 30 minutes to get help that you think is important to you? And actually it really isn't. I think a lot of people are just sort of weighing up like what's important to them, and company-wide, that's a big question.
Exactly. So let's get into the actual thread, which I've linked below if you want to follow along on Twitter. The entire thread, it's a really good one. I do recommend it. And the thread is basically different points that you've made after speaking to 1,500 people about remote work, and especially the trends that are going to emerge before 2030. One of them I wanted to talk about, and we were starting to talk about it earlier, is the remote living and remote visas. What do you see the trend happening there in the next 10 years, 9 years?
Yeah, I think like you start to see what people like Francis Suarez are doing, which is almost becoming like the CEO of a city and thinking about talent as people that they can recruit. Like, that's super interesting. And I think places like San Francisco have had carte blanche to treat people fairly terribly in terms of the value they're getting for living there. And really now people have got the choice. Do I want to live there? Do I want to live in New York anymore? Do I want to spend more time with my family? Do I want to live in the US? Do I want to move to Portugal? So yeah, I think there's a lot of innovation that has to happen to make it more to make people able to be more transient, because I think that's what people want. They don't want to be stuck in the same city for 12 months of a year. But there's obviously a lot of impediments in the way, whether that's taxation, whether it's visas. And I think if you take that a step further, there's the other side of the coin, which is you can't access these countries, so you're de facto disqualified from opportunity. Is that a net positive for companies as a whole being able to access talent? Probably not. So I think it changes in that respect as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So kind of going into that, from there, you've moved, let's say, and because you want to be closer to family, but you want to keep your job. How do you bring in then a work-life balance? One thing that always kicks around in our office is setting boundaries. That's a big issue. How do you recommend, and what are you seeing folks doing when they're trying to really get a work-life balance? And what does that actually mean?
Yeah. It's funny. I spend a lot of time talking to people about the future of work. And what I love to tell them is, like, stop thinking about it as the future of work. Start thinking about the possibilities for the future of living. And I think you're absolutely right. There's like two parts here, right? Like, everyone knows people have been locked in their homes. They're working too hard. They're burning out. So one thing we're starting to hear is companies basically prescribing a day off once a quarter, or they're doing like surprise days off. So you're just going to come in on a Tuesday and they're like, no, you're taking a day off. But I've got stuff to do. I don't care. Like, you're literally taking a day off. You've been working for 74 days straight. You haven't taken a day off. Like, you need the time. I think that's interesting. And I think, like, the other part is actually there's a whole rebalancing that has to happen. Like, the 9-to-5 work style has been great for one demographic and it's been garbage for everyone else. Single parents, super difficult to work in an office. People who care for family members, super difficult to work in an office. People who may have health conditions or impairments and they can't get into an office. So you just look at all these people being like disqualified or discriminated against from being able to work in an office, and you say, okay, now we're going to give you freedom to set your schedule. This is great. You can now work from 6 a.m. till 9 a.m, take a few hours off, drop the kids at school, go for a run, surf, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But now these people can access opportunity, which is incredible, because previously they just couldn't do that.
Right, exactly. And one group that I was also thinking about are returning adults to school. And just like, I mean, that's a whole other conversation, is reskilling and just skilling in general. And that's a huge opportunity for people who they want to do better in their job or get a better job. And now they have more flexibility to do so, especially with more online programs for education, which I think is fantastic. So I love the idea of that balance of being able to be where you want to be, where you as the employee want to be, and when you want to be there. So I think that definitely gives a lot more freedom, I think.
I think that's the goal. And I think there's obviously dangers that come with that, right? Like, I'm very good at talking to the opportunities of remote work, but I think it's also worth noting there are challenges, right? There's a real danger that some companies replicate the synchronous nature of offices, and that just means that not only are you like always on in the same way that you are in the office, but now you're always on at home. So that's super difficult.
Yeah,
and I think if we just take what we had in the office, we replicate remotely, we end up actually in, I would say, at least as bad a place as we're in the office, if not worse. So there's a lot of things that we do need to reinvent, and obviously it needs to evolve and grow and change. And if we don't do that, it's going to be problematic.
Exactly. And one of those things, I really wanted to talk about this, but BS tasks.
Yeah, I mean, it's
that kind of goes with it.
Yeah, I think like everyone who works in an office knows, like, people aren't productive for 8 hours a day. But you need to sit in that seat for 8 hours because your middle manager adjudicates your performance based on how long you're there. And, I mean, the whole thing's bullshit, like, all around there, like, how productive are people, or is it just the performance to make people fill that 8 hours and the company feels like they're getting their pound of flesh?
Yeah.
And I think like you start to think about it in those granular terms. Like, do you care that I sit in this seat for 8 hours, or do you care what I produce and the outcome of that? And the problem is many companies, the big problem is many companies aren't able to measure that outcome today, which propels a lot of that BS.
Right. So it would seem to me that instead of having like a quota of how many hours you're in, it's like, here are your tasks for the day, or here's what needs to be accomplished this week, however long it takes you. Because how many people, they drag out a task because they know, well, if I finish this, I have nothing else to do for the day, and my boss is just going to be mad at me. So I actually had a boss like that not that long ago, where if you needed to work remote, there was a coworker who wanted to go to a different state for a wedding, and our boss every 5 minutes, hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? And just not letting him work. And he needed to work at different times instead of the typical 9 to 5. And she just would not understand that. And I'm curious, do you think that there needs to be almost like a re-education or a retraining for leaders to really understand that 9 to 5 doesn't work anymore? Or how do we get that? How do we really understand?
I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think like the reality is middle management feels good when they feel like they're busy.
Yes.
And the only way that they feel like they're busy is if they can see what they're doing. If they can see what you're doing, they can pester you to check where you are in that task, or they can hold meetings just basically off the cuff, and then everyone has to go and do what they do. So I think there's a big thing that needs to change from being like time is the measurement inside companies to outcome. And there's like a lot's been written about objectives and key results and project management software, but largely most people don't use them, and they find it really difficult to break tasks down into things that they can say, well, actually, has someone achieved something? Like the problem is they don't know, I suspect. And yeah, that just makes them feel super uncomfortable because they don't feel useful or busy themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And so going back to just having that list of things that you need to do for the week, and that's how I work, is I need to have a checklist. And as I check them off, great, because that really shows me where my focus should be for that week, rather than, all right, I'm doing a whole bunch of just busy work. Like, I feel like I'm in grade school when my kids are given busy work, and like, no, I'm an adult. Treat me like an adult, please. And that's, I think, one thing that hasn't been touched on is how much of that is related to trust.
Almost all of it. I think it's like, do we trust our people? And I think the question, like pre-pandemic, people weren't working remotely. How can I trust my people to work while they're at home? And now, like, they've been forced into it. They never had a choice. So they know remote work works now. And it's really difficult to put that genie back in the bottle, so to speak. So I think their problem now becomes, okay, well, we kind of have to trust our people. Like, they did good work during a pandemic, and we pull them back to the office, we're going to lose our people to our biggest competitors. So I think ultimately they don't really have a choice.
Right. But then I'm also seeing products that I saw a product last week. I don't know if it was here in the US or where it was, but it was a chair that kind of logged you or monitored you. And if you were starting to be sluggish, and it would report to your boss whether or not you were productive. And I thought, that's not okay. That's invading your privacy at home, isn't it? So I'm curious, like, what are you seeing with managers trying to implement these products to make sure that their employees are working? I've heard of having employers making sure you have like a little timer on your computer of when you're working, and you have to like literally clock in, and it's like, that person is salary. What are you doing? So I'm curious, what are you saying to those people that are thinking about implementing those types of?
I think the way we think about it is like, this is just like surveillance capitalism on steroids. Like, you give someone some power and they feel uncomfortable, so they're going to wield that power to the maximum that they can. And there's a lot of things. I haven't heard about the chair. That's a new one to me. So
that one, it scared me. I'm not going to lie.
I mean, in some respects, I just feel disappointed by it. Like, people are doing their best, and people genuinely care about producing good work. Like, if you don't trust someone, why did you hire them? Like, that's where I always start with it. Like, you hired someone, you don't see what they're working on all day when they're in the office. Like, they can be on Facebook all day there. Why is it now a problem if you can't see what they're doing? Because it makes you feel better.
Exactly. Exactly. Just the word control.
Yeah.
Just, yeah, absolutely. That's so fascinating. Yeah, I'm just coming down to trust and you hire the person. Why did you hire them? And I think it comes back to in some of those cases, like, well, we needed a body. We needed somebody in that chair.
Yeah, and I think again, it's like we actually didn't know what we needed, like because we can't measure what we need for. Like we kind of need it for this bit, okay, but how much work is it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like
Yeah.
10% productive, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious then the companies that are more concerned about time spent in the office rather than the outcome or outputs that you were mentioning earlier, you know, how are they doing it? You know, how are they doing in sales and things like that? I'm curious because their production can't be as good as somebody who believes in letting your people just work. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I would love to see, like, I'm sure there's a number of PhDs studying this. Like, this has just been like a unique opportunity where they've got a data set that
Yeah.
I bet there's people like in April we're just immediately like we're gonna measure this and then we'll measure this after. Like, yeah, you're gonna see some interesting studies coming out across the next 3 years, I would imagine.
Yeah, those are going to be really fascinating and probably really depressing too. As long as you know people like you are really pushing this idea of no, this we can do this better. Um, Before, I mean, we have a few minutes left. We have about 8 minutes left, but I really wanted to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yeah.
Because that was one of your main points in the entire thread, and we started touching on it earlier. Of just by allowing and offering remote, you're going to diversify your talent pool. Yeah. And DEI is really special to our chapter, which is really why I wanted to bring it up because we are the first American Marketing Association chapter to have a board level specifically focusing on DEI. And then from that, our national association, AMA, has expanded their DEI efforts. So we are really proud of that. So with that, can you walk us through how D&I efforts with remote work can be expanded?
Yeah, so I think I touched upon it like 10 minutes ago. It's really about like how can we create a workplace that is more inclusive and accessible in many respects, and how can we democratize opportunity to people that previously couldn't access it. So single parents, people who care for other people, people with health conditions or impairments. Like this, for some of those people, the office is a really difficult place to work. They can't work 9 to 5. They need to pick their kids up, or they need to inject a family member with something, or they just physically can't get there. And I think like you start to think in those terms, and you say, okay, well, in terms of who doesn't find it a pleasant place to work, like what proportion of the workforce is that, or the potential workforce is that? So you start to think in those terms. You say, okay, well, there's a whole host of people who aren't currently employed, who are world-class people, who can't work for us as a company in an office. So just by going remote and just by offering the opportunity, you immediately open yourself to being able to attract those people. And I think the way like I think about it is, there's always going to be places that were great places for my dad to work. Like my dad's never going to struggle to work somewhere, like he grew up in an office. He's a certain age. He's seen to be like senior. Who cares about that? Like he's always going to be able to access work. What about everyone else? Like, and for me, when I was building the business, that was a question I always tried to answer. Like, how can I build the best place in the world for single mothers and fathers to work? How can I be the best place in the world for everyone else to work? And then I get this superpower of access to talent that my competitors aren't even fishing in. The implication, I think, of that, or the implication of that should be that we have the most diverse teams in history. We have the most inclusive teams in history. But as a result of that, we have the most talented teams in history as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And especially now with the pandemic, and more reports are being shown that women are leaving the workforce first in droves because childcare, that's a huge issue. So how do you see, I don't think this was touched on, but how do you see a shift in childcare with people working more remote?
So we've heard some interesting things, which is some companies are starting to think about how they can build childcare into a proposition where their people are working remotely.
Okay.
So I think when you start to think in those terms and you say, okay, well, we've seen a problem, like women are leaving the workforce. The reasons for that are obvious. surely we can do something to address that. And I think you're going to be able to tell pretty quickly, like, which companies care about this and who's just paying lip service to it.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And so one thing that I've noticed is in order to get some of these in place is you need to have representation at the leadership level. You know, you might have a group of, I don't want to be, I'm not gender biased or anything, but, you know, you might have a group of, you know, older white guys, their kids are out of the house already. They're not thinking about the young mother who needs a job. So I would imagine in order for all of this to change is we need to have more representation at the leadership level. And are you seeing any trends with that? Are you seeing anybody or hearing anything from anybody?
I think what we have seen, which is interesting, is you're starting to see a lot of head of remotes appear in large companies. And there are a lot of women, like a lot of incredible women leading in that space. Facebook, probably the most prominent example. So Annie Dean joined there, I think a couple of months ago. And I think that's incredibly important. If you're setting up a new function in a business, you need to be cognizant of the differences between different people and their living situations. And I think just to give some anecdote to that, the other pushback we get is, well, what about young people living in cities? Like, they live with 4 housemates, and how are they meant to work from home? And you're like, well, is that a problem with remote working, or is that a problem with the cost of living in a city where you need to be close enough to commute regularly? If they don't have to be there, do they live closer to family? Can they afford somewhere to live rather than having a flat share with 8 different people who are basically sleeping in bunk beds? So I think you're absolutely right. Like the dissonance between what people's expectations are in terms of in that leadership position, who haven't experienced those things in their lives because it was a different world 30 years ago, is huge. And if they're not told or shown how the difference is, I think there's a big problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I always say, you know, as a leader, as president of this organization, I can't think of everything. There's no way, there's just no possible way one person can think of every single perspective. And that's why I think it's more important to bring in people who really do know that perspective. So glad to see, you know, especially like you mentioned Facebook, and they're kind of leading that with women leaders. And I think that's a good start, but you know, it's still going to take some time. So, and one of the bigger issues that I hear from people who are newer to remote work, especially since the pandemic started, is that they feel like they're working more now than when they were in the office.
Yeah.
And one of the tweets in your thread, I'm going to just read it, is working too much. Companies that worry that workers won't work enough when operating remotely. The opposite will be true, and it becomes a big problem. Remote workers burning out because they work too much will have to be addressed. We did talk about this earlier, but I just wanted to, you know, bring it out just a little more. You were mentioning companies that are maybe building childcare or, you know, burning out, like you said, having one day a month where employees just can go do their thing. And the company that I'm working for, they have that Impactful Fridays, which is fantastic. Awesome. Yeah. What are some other things, just from your perspective, your suggestions, what can be done?
Yeah, I think I think in some respects it's about empathetic leadership is probably the best solution to this, where leaders see this happening. Like if I speak to you every day and I can see, like, we're on video, I can see something's not wrong. And there's ways to ask that, right? You're like, well, is everything okay? And I think everyone's immediate response is like, yeah, everything's fine. You're like, but actually, is everything fine? Like, is there anything I can do to help you? And I think, like, it's a completely different type of leadership actually that's needed. Like, the office is very much command and control, right? We're going to tell you what you need to do. You're going to do it, or you're going to perform, or you're not going to perform. And I'm going to punish you based on that or not. Yeah. And now it's like, well, people are doing like their best in a situation that's incredibly difficult. I'm homeschooling. My partner is a teacher. She's homeschooling her own class from home. My kids are being homeschooled at home. So I think if you're not an empathetic leader, it's something that they really struggle with. So I think we're not at a place yet where we've got specific tools that we can use. I think we will see those emerge. I think companies want that. But I think it's just something where individuals have to take responsibility and say, like, are you guys okay? Like, is everything fine? Like, tell me if there's something I can do to help. And I think there's a vulnerability to that as well, right? Like, if everything isn't fine, you need to be able to trust your boss that you can say, well, actually, like the events of the last week have been super distracting for me. And
Mm-hmm.
you need to trust that they're going to be able to listen to that and actually help you out with that.
Right. And I think touching on that, one reason why an employee may not bring something up is because they're afraid of retaliation.
Mm-hmm.
If you bring up something like that's not going well, that boss might be like, well, this person clearly can't handle it. I'm going to let them go. And instead of supporting them, it's funny, growing up in the Midwest and working there for a long time, that was kind of that mentality. And I hope it's different now since I don't live there anymore. But it was, if you were late by 3 minutes, you'd get written up, even if you worked in an office.
You get the, oh, good afternoon. You're like, dude, it's 3 minutes past 8. I just dropped my kid off at school.
Exactly. And I don't know how many times where, well, that doesn't matter. You were stuck behind a train or a boat that was, traveling. Yeah. Tough. You're late. I'm going to write you up. And if you're written up 3 times, you're fired. And that still makes me so cringe, because it feels as though the boss cares more about that time that you're there rather than the work, and kind of what we were talking about earlier. And I'm hoping that kind of goes away, punishing people for something that's out of their hands. So,
well, I agree.
Are you hearing anything like that from people, or?
I think what we are hearing is people are certainly more open to flexibility. It just doesn't make sense. If you're working in a remote way, you're becoming more asynchronous. Like, why do I want to dictate to you that you should work 8 till 5? Like, if you're most productive working from 4 a.m. till 7 a.m, I do not care. Work from 4 a.m. till 7 a.m. If you need to take 6 hours off to go surfing and then you come back and you're incredibly productive for 5 hours,
yeah,
I got 8 hours of productivity out of you when you're in an office, I probably got 3.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, the question is, like, it's not, in my eyes at least, like, there's certain companies will never think like this, but it's like, how can I empower you on an individual level to perform the best you've ever performed?
Yes, that's
I think all that matters.
Yeah, that's the best sum up. That sentence is the best sum up. How can I help you be at your best? And I think that's really what it comes down to. And I hope we're ready for that. I really do.
I must admit, I've got a few doubts. Like, I think there's older, crustier leadership that are always going to struggle with this, and it'll take time. But I think eventually things do change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I just realized what time it is, and we're at half an hour. So is there anything you want to add? Anything that we maybe didn't touch on that you feel like you want to kind of make sure we don't forget?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, like, the biggest thing for me is just, like, let's avoid replicating the office, because the office isn't a very good place. Like, culturally, like, I'm not saying people don't love seeing their colleagues. I obviously love seeing my co-founders and my teammates. Are we productive if we see each other every day in an office? No, we wouldn't be. Like, to be quite frank, are we productive if we see each other once a week, once a month, once a quarter? We're way more productive. And actually, we care about each other more as well, because rather than it being Monday morning and I'm speaking to my CTO and I'm like, oh, did you see the football game last night? He's like, yeah, great game. Like, it's just inane nonsense that you never build a relationship below skin level. Whereas if I see someone once a month, I can be like, oh, how's your twins? Like,
yeah,
what have they been doing, and how's your family? And actually, you do care because you're there for that specific reason. I think exactly. Like, can we cling to that as remote work becomes a bigger thing? Who knows? But I hope so.
Yeah. And one thing we didn't even touch on, which would add to all of that, is travel time and commuting. So that could be a whole different conversation. So yeah, maybe that'll be a future episode. So yeah, Chris, thank you so much for your time today. Again, especially with that time difference, and it's the evening. So it's morning here for me. So I appreciate it. I have all of Chris's information and links in the description, including the thread that I keep talking about. So so you can see what I'm talking about. If you enjoyed today's interview, please tap the like button and subscribe so you make sure you're getting our newest fun stuff. So Chris, again, thank you.
Appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. And have a great day, everyone.